Have you ever wondered why Israel, this tiny sliver of land on the Mediterranean, seems to stand at the center of history again and again? How did a people scattered across the world for centuries manage to keep their identity alive when so many ancient cultures simply faded away? Today we're diving deep into one of the most remarkable stories of resilience, conflict, faith, and hope. And by the end of this journey, you might see not just Israel, but the entire human story a little differently. The ancient origins let's start way back, thousands of years ago, in a place called Canaan. This wasn't an empty land waiting for someone to claim it. It was already bustling with diverse peoples and customs when a man named Abraham, guided by a voice he believed was God, arrived with a radical promise echoing in his heart that his descendants would inherit this land. Abraham's story is more than a dusty legend. Imagine leaving everything familiar, your city, your language, even your family gods, to follow a single mysterious calling. That willingness to step into the unknown became the heartbeat of a people who would later endure the unimaginable. Abraham had a son, Isaac. Isaac had Jacob, and Jacob, well, he was the father of 12 sons, each of whom would become the head of what we now call the 12 tribes of Israel. That's where the famous story of Joseph comes in. Joseph, betrayed by jealous brothers, sold into slavery, yet somehow rising to power in Egypt. It almost feels like destiny's favorite plot twist. The one everyone thought was lost becomes the very reason they all survived. The Exodus and a new identity, but then, history took a darker turn. Jacob's descendants, the Israelites, settled in Egypt, grew numerous, and were eventually enslaved. For centuries, they toiled under harsh rulers, building monuments for pharaohs while their own dreams crumbled. And here we meet another pivotal figure, Moses. Picture an old man standing before the might of the Egyptian empire, declaring to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." It's a line so iconic that even today, it resonates beyond religious circles, a timeless demand for freedom. The Exodus wasn't just an escape from slavery, it was the forging of an identity. Wandering through a barren wilderness for 40 years isn't exactly anyone's dream retirement plan, but it was during this hardship that the Israelites received what would become their spiritual backbone, the 10 Commandments lost carved in stone at Mount Sinai. These weren't just religious rituals, they were a framework for justice, ethics, and communal life. Real-world reflection pause here for a second. Have you ever felt like you were wandering your own desert, waiting for something to change? The story of Moses is a reminder that sometimes the most profound transformations happen in the wilderness, far from comfort. The conquest of Canaan. Eventually, under Joshua, they entered Canaan, but the land wasn't handed to them on a silver platter. It was a land filled with fortified cities and rival kings. The conquest stories, from Jericho's crumbling walls to countless other battles, reveal a raw struggle for survival in space. It's messy, it's morally complex, and it shaped a people fiercely protective of their heritage. From tribes to kingdom, once settled, Israel was a collection of loosely connected tribes, each with its own territory and local leaders called judges. Imagine a patchwork of small communities, vulnerable to frequent raids by powerful neighbors like the Philistines. This is where colorful characters like Samson come in, a judge whose strength lay not just in muscle, but also in divine purpose, despite his many flaws. Eventually, the Israelites looked around and thought, why don't we have a king like everyone else? It was a turning point. They crowned Saul, but it was David, the shepherd boy who defeated Goliath, who truly unified the tribes. David wasn't perfect. His life was a storm of victories, personal failures, and heartfelt psalms that still move us today. David's son, Solomon, inherited this kingdom at its golden peak. Under Solomon, Jerusalem became not just a political capital, but a spiritual heart. With the building of the first temple, a magnificent structure that symbolized the unique covenant between this people and their God, adding personal reflection. Isn't it striking how the longing for security and unity led them from tribal judges to mighty kings? But as we'll see, power often comes with a dangerous cost, foreshadowing trouble, because after Solomon, things started to unravel. The kingdom split in two, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. This division made them weak and vulnerable, easy prey for rising empires. The northern kingdom fell first, swallowed by Assyria. Then came Babylon, which crushed Judah, burned Jerusalem, and destroyed Solomon's majestic temple. Imagine standing in the ruins of what you believed was the very dwelling place of God. The trauma must have been unimaginable. The exile. Many Israelites were marched off to Babylon. Here's where their story could have ended: scattered, leaderless, defeated. Most nations absorbed into empires like this simply disappeared into history books. But not Israel. Instead, something remarkable happened. Stripped of their land and temple, the Jewish people doubled down on what they could carry with them: their laws, their stories, and their hope. Synagogues replaced the temple, rabbis replaced priests, and scrolls of scripture became the new sanctuary. It was in exile that Judaism truly took shape into a faith that could survive without borders. So what kept them going? How did these exiles, living under foreign kings, keep their unique identity alive for centuries while mighty Babylon itself eventually fell into dust? In our next part, we'll explore how Persia, Greece, and Rome each left their mark on this remarkable people, and why, even when the entire world seemed against them, they refused to vanish. And we'll pick up with the astonishing resilience of the Jews under new empires, the fierce fight of the Maccabees, and the birth of tensions that still echo today. Let's pick up right where we left off, with the Jews in exile, clinging to their faith in a foreign land. Then, out of nowhere, the tide shifted. The mighty Babylonian Empire fell to Cyrus the Great of Persia. Unlike previous conquerors, Cyrus did something remarkable. He allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This moment is captured not just in the Bible, but also on the famous Cyrus cylinder, an archaeological find that shows how radical his policies of tolerance really were. Imagine the first caravans of exiles cresting the hills, seeing Jerusalem's ruins. Think of the heartbreak mixed with hope. It's one thing to be allowed home, but it's another to face the monumental task of rebuilding your life from ashes. Yet they did it. Under leaders like Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, the walls of Jerusalem rose again. The Second Temple was dedicated. A community once shattered by war started to breathe again. Personal reflection. I think there is something deeply human in this. The drive to return and to rebuild even when all seems lost. Maybe that's why so many of us, after seasons of personal ruin, still try to patch together our own walls and plant gardens in old wounds. Greek influence and the struggle for identity, but peace never lasted long. In this corner of the world, centuries passed, and then came Alexander the Great. His conquest spread Greek culture, philosophy, and language across vast territories, including Judah. This created a profound tension. Some Jews embraced Greek ways, enjoying theater, gymnasiums, and philosophical debates. Others recoiled, seeing it as a threat to their sacred identity. This wasn't just cultural, it was spiritual. Could they be God's distinct people and still blend in with powerful new ideas? Eventually, under the Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV Epiphanes, things turned dark. He outlawed key Jewish practices and even desecrated the temple by sacrificing a pig on its altar. This was more than an insult. It was a spiritual assault on everything they held holy. Real story, the Maccabees. Out of this oppression rose a family that became legends, the Maccabees. Picture small bands of Jewish rebels, vastly outnumbered, hiding in hills and launching daring attacks against trained armies. Their fight was fueled not just by nationalism, but by a deep conviction that God's covenant couldn't be erased by foreign kings. Their revolt succeeded. The temple was cleansed and rededicated, an event commemorated even today in Hanukkah. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a statement that faith and identity mattered more than even life itself. Pause for thought. It makes you wonder, what are we willing to stand up for when the cost gets real? Most of us will never be asked to defend our beliefs with swords, but every day we face smaller moments that test what we truly value. Roman rule and rising tensions. Fast forward a bit, and Rome stepped into the picture. At first, they offered stability, but over time, their rule became harsher. Heavy taxes crushed the poor. Local kings like Herod, technically Jewish but politically Roman puppets, ruled with lavish excess while most people struggled to afford bread. Into this mix came countless would-be messiahs. Men promised liberation from Roman rule, leading small revolts that were swiftly and brutally crushed. The air was thick with longing for a king who would throw off foreign chains and restore David's golden throne. So when Jesus of Nazareth began teaching in dusty villages, performing miracles, and speaking of a kingdom, you can see why people started whispering, could this be the one? Jesus versus expectations. But here is the twist that we talked about in part 1. Jesus' kingdom didn't look like they expected. He rode into Jerusalem not on a war horse, but on a donkey. Instead of rallying troops, he wept over the city's fate. Instead of overthrowing Romans, he challenged hearts. For many, this was devastating. The long-awaited Messiah was supposed to crush Rome, not suffer under it. To them, a crucified Messiah was a contradiction in terms. And yet, from a spiritual perspective, Jesus was dealing with a deeper empire, the empire of sin and death. He waged war not with swords, but with sacrificial love. Reflection, a timeless misunderstanding that makes me pause and think, how often do we miss what God is doing because it doesn't match our script? How many of our prayers are actually demands for God to fit into our plans, instead of invitations for us to be reshaped by His? The destruction of Jerusalem, sadly, this misunderstanding had catastrophic consequences. About 40 years after Jesus' ministry, Jewish zealots rose up in full rebellion against Rome. It was an explosion of pent-up anger and nationalistic hope. Rome responded with crushing force. In 70 AD, they surrounded Jerusalem. Starvation set in. Factions inside the city tore each other apart. And finally, Roman legions breached the walls, destroyed the Second Temple, and set the city ablaze. Josephus, a Jewish historian who witnessed it, described horrors that almost defy belief. It was as if the hopes of centuries lay buried under rubble and ash. Adding a modern lens, and yet, somehow the Jewish people did not disappear. Even stripped of their land and temple again, they carried their identity into every corner of the world. From Babylon to Spain, from Poland to Morocco, from New York to Tel Aviv, they kept lighting Sabbath candles, teaching their children Hebrew prayers, and waiting for promises that still felt unfinished. So where does that leave us today? How did this small, battered people not only survive, but reemerge in modern times with a state of their own, sparking debates, alliances, and prophecies that many believe are still unfolding right before our eyes? In next part, we'll look at the extraordinary modern rebirth of Israel, the lingering mysteries of prophecy, and what their story reveals about hope, purpose, and the endurance of the human spirit. The modern miracles, so let's fast forward through the centuries. After Rome's destruction of Jerusalem, the Jewish people were scattered across the globe. They faced waves of persecution. The Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, Russian pogroms, Nazi concentration camps. By every rule of history, they should have vanished. Most nations, torn from their homeland and dispersed for thousands of years, simply fade into memory. But the Jewish people didn't. Instead, something astonishing happened in the 20th century, against all odds, after the horrors of the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were murdered simply for existing. A battered remnant returned to the ancient land. In 1948, the modern state of Israel was declared. Pause and let that sink in. A people exiled for nearly 2 millennia, speaking dozens of different languages, somehow revived not only a homeland, but also their ancient tongue, Hebrew, which had mostly survived only in prayer books. Real-world parallel, language revival think. About it, imagine if today someone tried to bring back Latin as the everyday language of Italy, expecting kids to text in it, soldiers to shout commands in it, mothers to sing lullabies in it. That's how improbable the revival of Hebrew was. Yet it happened, and today, you'll hear modern Hebrew spoken in coffee shops from Tel Aviv to Haifa. Is this prophecy unfolding? This is where many people, religious or not, pause and wonder, could this be more than just geopolitical maneuvering? Could it actually be the unfolding of ancient prophecies right before our eyes? The Hebrew scriptures are full of promises that God would scatter Israel among the nations, and then, in the last days, gather them back. Verses in Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Jeremiah read almost like news headlines today. Even skeptics often find it hard to explain how these texts, written thousands of years ago, align so closely with modern events. Adding a personal story, I remember chatting with an older man in Jerusalem. He had survived the Soviet Gulag, made it to Israel in the 1990s, and now ran a tiny bakery. His eyes sparkled as he told me, "I prayed in Russian prison camps that someday I would need bread in Jerusalem." Now look, moments like that make history feel painfully alive. You realize this isn't just about nations and armies. It's about ordinary people, carrying ancient hopes inside battered bodies, building something new out of the ashes of old dreams, the ongoing tensions. Of course, the story isn't wrapped up with a neat bow. The rebirth of Israel brought joy for Jews worldwide, but also deep pain and displacement for many Palestinians, whose lives were forever changed. The land remains a focal point of global tension. Wars, peace talks, terror attacks, economic miracles, archaeological discoveries, it is all still playing out on the same rocky hills, where David herded sheep and Jesus walked dusty roads. And if you open a newspaper today, you'll still see headlines echoing conflicts that trace back to these ancient roots. It's like history refuses to stay buried. What this means for us. So what do we take from all this? For me, there are three powerful lessons. 1. Identity can outlast empires. Think about Babylon, Rome, the Ottoman Empire, even Nazi Germany, all tried to erase the Jewish people. Those empires are gone, but Jewish prayers still rise every Friday evening, welcoming the Sabbath. It's a living testament that sometimes fragile things endure where mighty ones crumble. To dot the importance of story, why didn't the Jewish people disappear? Because they told their story over and over, at Passover tables, in whispered prayers, in songs sung through tears. They remembered who they were, even when the world told them they were nothing. It makes me wonder, what stories do we tell ourselves about who we are? Because those narratives can shape us for generations. 3. Hope isn't optional. It's essential. Finally, hope isn't just some fluffy spiritual concept. It's often the thin thread that keeps people moving forward when everything else says stop. From Babylon to Auschwitz to modern threats, hope was the defiant spark that refused to go out. Personal takeaway, maybe that's the deepest resonance of Israel's story. It's easy to read it as just an old saga, kings and prophets, wars and exiles. But really, it's a mirror held up to every person who's ever felt crushed, displaced, or on the edge of giving up. Because if a scattered, oppressed people could survive centuries of persecution, hold onto their identity, and somehow come home again, maybe there's hope for whatever scattered pieces of your life feel beyond repair. Any reflection, so here is my encouragement to you. Don't underestimate the power of remembering who you are. Don't stop telling your story, even if it feels small. And above all, don't let go of hope, because sometimes the impossible isn't just possible, it becomes history. If you found this journey through ancient resilience and modern miracle moving, drop a comment below. Tell me, what part of Israel's story, or your own, gives you hope that broken things can be rebuilt? And hey, if you want more timeless stories that still shape our world today, consider subscribing. Together, we'll keep exploring the mysteries that tie the past to the present, and maybe discover a few threads that lead straight to your heart.